Welcome to Chapter 18.2. The French Revolution Unfolds. In France, the political crisis of 1789 coincided with a terrible famine. Peasants were starving and unemployed, and in such desperate times, rumors ran wild. Inflamed by famine and fear, peasants unleashed their fury on the nobles, and meanwhile, a variety of factions in Paris competed to gain power. Moderates looked to the Marquis de Lafayette for leadership. However, there was a more radical group called the Paris Commune, and they replaced the city's royalist government. Storming of the Bastille and the peasant uprising pushed the National Assembly into action. In late August, the Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens, and it proclaimed that all male citizens were equal before the law. And this upset the women, but that they did not also have equal rights. Journalist Olympe de Gouges wrote a declaration that provided for this, but the Assembly did not adopt it. Nor was King Louis XVI willing to accept any of these reforms. A lot of anger was directed at the Queen, Marie Antoinette, who lived a life of great extravagance. The National Assembly produced the Constitution of 1791, and this document reflected Enlightenment goals, such as setting up a limited monarchy and ensuring equality before the law for all male citizens, and ending of church interference in government. The events in France stirred debate all over Europe. Some applauded the reforms of the National Assembly. The rulers of other nations, however, denounced it. Horror stories were told by the émigrés who had fled from France. Rulers of neighboring monarchies increased the border patrols to stop the spread of the French plague of revolution. In October of 1791, the newly elected Legislative Assembly took office, but falling currency values, rising prices, and food shortages renewed the turmoil within France. The working-class men and women, called the sans-culottes, pushed the revolution in a more radical direction, and they demanded a republic. The sans-culottes found support among other radicals, especially the Jacobins. And the radicals soon held the power in the Legislative Assembly, and eager to spread the revolution, they declared war against Austria and other European monarchies. During the period of 1791 to 1794, there was at first a relative calm, where the economy started to improve, and the Legislative Assembly was able to start the draft of the civil constitution of the clergy, which they later passed as a piece of legislation. And this constitution basically turned clergymen into employees of the government, and turned the church property into property of the state. The Assembly soon sold off and confiscated a lot of that property to pay part of the national debt, but the attack on the clergy and the church really turned a lot of faithful Catholics living in France against the Assembly. When Louis XVI signed this new constitution into law in September 15th of 1791, the goals of the bourgeoisie leaders of the Assembly had been fulfilled, which were basically the power of the nobility and the church had been broken, and France was now a constitutional monarchy. But events would soon turn the revolution into a more radical phase. One of the first events was the king's attempt to secretly flee Paris. The king tried to head north to rally supporters so that he could attack Paris and bring it under his control again. This fleeing of Paris became known as the Flight of Varennes, or Varennes, and it was completely a disaster. He and the royal family were captured and forcibly returned to Paris, and he was officially forgiven, but the Assembly never trusted him again, and he was put under house arrest, even more strict house arrest. But then also there was the outbreak of the war between France, Austria, and Prussia. This was another thing that pushed France into a more radical stage of the revolution. The French aristocratic émigrés who had not approved of all the radical changes were urging Austria and Prussia to come to the aid of Louis XVI. However, both Louis and the Assembly wanted the war, and Louis, because he believed that the country would have to turn to him to lead it in a time of war, and the Assembly because they believed that it would unite the Frenchmen in a common cause. So when the combined forces of the Austria, Prussia invaded France, French armies collapsed and the country went into a panic. The third thing that started the radicalization of this French Revolution was the division of the National Assembly into political factions. There was a development of political factions in the Assembly that revealed a very different opinions and goals and aims of this revolution that had always been lurking underneath the surface and were becoming more evident as time went on. In order to try to diffuse the rivalries that were happening, the National Assembly voted to dissolve itself and hold elections to form a new legislative assembly. But this actually just failed. So historians have divided the French Revolution into 4 major periods. The first is the National Assembly period. And in this period, France became a constitutional monarchy. In the second stage, there was the Reign of Terror, and this is where a radical phase of the French Revolution occurs, and it creates more and more violence, and this is when the French monarchy is destroyed. The king is killed. The third phase is the Directory, which happens when the Reign of Terror comes to an end with the death of Robespierre, and a new set of rulers or judges are put in place. And this is a period of trying to calm things down, but it is unsuccessful. And finally, the last stage is the Age of Napoleon, when a lot of the changes that were made during the French Revolution are consolidated and new changes are introduced. And it's also a time period when France is at war with pretty much all of its neighbors. From the beginning, the Parisian crowd and its willingness to do violence had been a factor in this revolution, but it had been a force with essentially traditional and conservative aims. Basically, they wanted the king to pay attention and to take proper care of his people. But by 1792, the crowd had changed. The working people now could be seen to come to meetings in political clubs, and they began discussing the things that still needed to be done that would bring about true equality. Once the men and women of the sans-culottes began to assert themselves, the political power belonged to whoever they would support. So this fact became evident on October 10th of 1792, when the crowds stormed first the royal palace and then the hall of the assembly. And unable to resist the crowd, the leaders of the assembly voted to depose and imprison the king and immediately convene a new national convention to deal with this crisis that they were facing. The membership of the National Convention were elected by universal manhood suffrage, and they were more radical than their predecessors. And in September of 1792, it voted to abolish the monarchy and to proclaim France a republic. It also managed to reorganize the French army and to push the invading Austrian and Prussian forces back across the border. When the convention proclaimed that war was to be an extension of the revolution, and they vowed to carry it anywhere where people yearned for liberty and freedom, the monarchies of Europe responded by forming a coalition to crush the revolution. So in January of 1793, the convention put Louis XVI on trial for treason. The debate that followed his conviction revealed a split between the powerful factions within the convention. The Girondins, whose membership tended to come from the wealthiest of the bourgeoisie, were mostly opposed to executing him, but the Jacobins, whose membership came from the lower classes, or the lower bourgeoisie, were very adamant that he should die. So the vote was close, but the Jacobins prevailed, and Louis was sent to the guillotine on January 21st, 1793. The execution of the king, combined with the decision to increase the number of men in the army, caused large anti-convention uprisings throughout France. In Paris, the Jacobins used the revolt as an opportunity to purge the Girondins from the convention. So in June of 1793, the Jacobin-led mob occupied the convention hall and refused to leave it until the Girondins resigned. Those Girondins who refused to resign were arrested. The purged convention then passed the law of Maxim to basically cap the price of bread so that it couldn't go above a certain point. And there were other essentials that were drafted into this new constitution, but it basically guaranteed the universal manhood suffrage, universal education, subsistence wages, and other forms of egalitarian things, and democratic republic, which was part of the new constitution. The convention also declared a 12-man committee of public safety. This would end up being a very, very brutal decision. They paid with their lives. Almost a total power was given to these 12, and it was to try to protect their fragile republic from its enemies within the committee and also from without. Maximilien Robespierre gained control of this Committee of Public Safety through his ability to persuade his fellow Jacobins and sans-culottes so they would follow him. Under Robespierre's leadership, the committee instituted what became known as the Reign of Terror, and arguing that in times of revolution, terror was the necessary companion of virtue. Robespierre created tribunals in all the major cities of France to try anybody who was suspected of being an enemy of the revolution. So during this period of terror between 1773 and 74, about 200,000 to 400,000 people were sentenced to prison, and between 25,000 and 50,000 of them were believed to have died either in prison or on the guillotine. Among these victims of the terror were those who rivaled Robespierre's for power. So in April of 1794, Robespierre had to reassess the terror. He had basically lost the support of the Jacobins and the crowd, and by July of 1794, Robespierre himself was arrested and tried and executed by that same terror machine that he had created. The execution of Robespierre marked the end of a radical phase of the revolution, as the exhausted Paris, devoid of its radical leaders, succumbed to the reassertion of power by the bourgeoisie.